one of the lessons from the uprisings of 2011 is that actually young people want to engage, and they are engaging as soon as space is given to them. So we saw an entire generation of new leadership emerge. At the same time, starting in 2013, what we saw is an exclusion of these youth from the formal processes for a couple of reasons. I mean, one is the processes in our region are themselves quite exclusive. They're dominated by, traditional leadership circles. But two, as well, these structures, including many of the political parties in our region, but also UN mediation processes and so forth, they don't respond to the aspirations of youth for more accessible, more horizontal type of mechanisms. So my recommendation, the best way to encourage youth participation is not to actually talk about training or capacity building of youth, but to actually revisit the power structures, revisit the structures of negotiations that are unfortunately still too exclusive, not just for youth, women, but also, frankly, entire segments of the population that have historically been marginalized. Okay, it's always a pleasure to be at the annual conference. Particularly at this time, it's absolutely necessary to create spaces to encourage dialogue across the Mediterranean, to rethink of the Mediterranean the way Europeans and countries in the Arab region thought of when the Barcelona process started, as a space for collaboration, as opposed to what we're seeing today, the Mediterranean as a hard border, as a sea where migrants unfortunately die in indifference, and where we see policies that are all about setting barriers and restrictions. So it's, for me, it's always important to come to these spaces, to try to reimagine what the Mediterranean could be at a time where really the Mediterranean today has unfortunately become a space of contestation, a space of restriction, and I'm one of those who still believe that actually the Mediterranean should be a space for cooperation. It should be a space that brings people together across the different Mediterranean. And I would also add, it's always a pleasure to interact with and meet some of the young researchers that I saw this year, to listen to their areas of interest, their research, but also their challenges. So I think, just very happy to be here. The EU obviously is very much engaged in the Mediterranean. The problem is, what is defining EU policy today vis-à-vis the Mediterranean? And really what has emerged is migration and energy, particularly after Russia's war in Ukraine. Now, for me, I recognize these are very important pillars for European countries, but you cannot build an entire strategy just on these two pillars. What Europe should be investing in is, in a way, a new anchoring policy for the southern and eastern Mediterranean to encourage much more, I would say, spaces of collaboration across a wider area. Yes, energy, yes, migration, but also to talk about values like better governance, again, to talk about, better economic policies. The Southern Med is in a very difficult situation, as well as the Eastern Med. We also saw the EU turn its back on many of the conflicts in the region, in the sense of it still sends a lot of money as aid, but it's not politically engaged in many conflicts that are today frozen. And we see that, for instance, in Syria, right? The EU today is not a major diplomatic player, unfortunately, on Syria. It has left the space to Russia, Iran, and Turkey. We see this in Libya, where really, not only was the EU an important player, but also France and Italy have a very direct role in the conflict there, and it's important that the EU gets engaged. We see this increasingly on Israel-Palestine, with very tragic circumstances, what's happening right now, with the latest round of war that is happening there, and the EU approaching this simply from a humanitarian or development perspective, as opposed to really weighing in politically. So as opposed to, I would say, particular themes that the EU should add, is maybe, and I realize it's difficult, particularly given what's happening in Ukraine, but there's a real need today to really think about the EU as a key anchor to encourage more prosperity and peace in the region, and not to see the EU disengage in a form of Fortress Europa and try to use the Mediterranean, but also autocrats as the coast guards of Europe. I think this policy would not lead to positive outcomes for Europe and obviously for the region.